84% of Americans think that the meaning of life is to make yourself happy. 84%, like that's a whopping majority, that the chief end of man is to glorify and enjoy yourself forever, basically. I think it was 91% said that to find the answers, look within. So what we're up against here is what I call the cult of self-worship that's just coming at us from every direction.
Should you follow your heart? I get to have a fascinating conversation with my good friend, Dr. Thaddeus Williams, about his brand new book, Don't Follow Your Heart. Spoiler alert, that's what we're going to be talking about today. He's a professor at Biola University, authored a ton of great books, including Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, 12 Questions Christians Should Ask About Social Justice, several others. Prolific author. I'll point to all those in a minute. But Thaddeus, it is great to have you on today, so thanks for jumping by.
Jonathan, great to see you again, brother.
All right, so you've got the book, Don't Follow Your Heart. And so obviously every book has a story. Why did you feel the need to write this book now?
Sure. Well, the inspiration is from my now 13-year-old, Holland, who we call Dutch for short. Dutch and I, well, my wife and I, with all the kids, play a game called Spot the Lie that we learned from Os Guinness, the great Christian culture commentator, theologian, just all-around smart guy. He introduced us to the game Spot the Lie, where whatever your kids are watching, rather than them just being passive consumers of whatever propaganda is coming at them, if they can point out a falsehood and explain why it's false, my wife and I give them $1. So little financial incentive, never hurt anybody. And they're getting so good at it that, I might be living in a cardboard box before too long here. But about 3 years ago, Holland, or Dutch, comes jumping down the stairs, big smile on her face. Daddy, you owe me another $1. All right, what'd you find this time, darling? And she had been watching a commercial for whatever unicorn, rainbow, fairy, pixie princess toy, whatever. And she said, Dad, the commercial told me I should follow my heart. And I said, okay, where's the lie? And her response, permanently filed in the proud daddy moment folder in my memory, she said, Daddy, I don't want to follow my heart. My heart is fallen. I'd way rather follow God's heart. And I was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. Wrapped my arms around her, gave her a big hug, and she earned $5 for that one. So that was really the inspiration for the book. She's actually on the cover. That is her right there in her, on all my books. I try to hide the kids on there somehow, so she gets to show that off to her friends at school, her cover modeling career. But I realized that propaganda is coming at these upcoming generations in a way that is really unprecedented. Whether it's, the Frozen anthem, no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. Whether it's the Disney shorts called Small Potatoes, where the moral of one of their episodes was, and I quote, "There's no right or wrong way to do anything, children. Do what you want." So the moral of the story was, there's no moral to any story. Just make your own. Follow your heart. Craft your own reality. Be your authentic self. Don't let anybody tell you what's right or wrong. And so I saw, man, this is really sweeping the nation, not just aimed at little formative minds, but I document in the book that 84% of Americans think that the meaning of life is to make yourself happy. 84%, like that's a whopping majority, that the chief end of man is to glorify and enjoy yourself forever, basically. 86% said to be happy, do what you desire most. So there's that follow your desires, be true to yourself mindset. And then 91% said that to find the answers, look within. So what we're up against here is what I call the cult of self-worship that's just coming at us from every direction.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so perceptive because number one, I mean, probably that $5 is a recurring payment to your daughter, right? Because that's an amazing dad moment. It's like, you know what? I'm gonna drop the mic. I'm out. That's we're done. There's no other parenting stories that ever need to be told, right?
There you go.
Like, because I know you're a dad, like 4 kids, right?
Yep.
Yep, and I've got three, and you also teach at Biola University, and so you get to be around students, Gen Z, millennials. I get to teach Impact 360 around Gen Z a ton as well. But I'd love to hear just what are some stories maybe from the classroom or something like that. We'll get into you've got 10 different hashtags. You've got lots of different stuff we'll get into on your book, Don't Follow Your Heart. But I'm curious, maybe share a story of something maybe you encountered that illustrates kind of the urgency of why this is so important, just from maybe students you get to see as well as kind of what you're seeing in the classroom.
Sure. So, the university years tend to be, this is the time in life to sort of carve out my own identity, figure out who I am, what do I want out of life. That's sort of always gone with the terrain of at least the American university experience. And I noticed, I'd say probably the last 6 or 7 years, those questions have been like turned up to volume 11, where there's this, not every student, but there has been a noticeable shift of really a self-obsession. I find a lot of students are really, really worried about themselves in a way that, there's normal, I'm figuring myself out, this is college stuff. But there's an added urgency, a pressure to it, where now the idea is if I have to follow my heart, if I have to be true to myself, if I have to craft my own identity and then sustain that identity over time in a meaningful way, I find a lot of students are getting really overwhelmed, sort of crushed by that impossible weight. Because if you think about it, creating and sustaining an identity over time is a God-sized task. God defines us. And if we become our own functional deities, and it's on our finite shoulders now as creatures, not the creator, to make our own identities and sustain them, I see students buckling under that impossible weight. I see, and John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, Coddling of the American Mind, they document this skyrocket in virtually every demographic of negative emotion. So anxiety rates have just jumped off the charts over the course of the last, 8 to 10 years. Rates of suicidal ideation have skyrocketed. And there's obviously multiple factors behind those peaks on all the charts. But I would say one of the factors that we don't talk about or identify as much as we should is putting that impossible pressure to follow your heart and be true to yourself. So that's something I see in the classroom every semester, and then getting to teach like theology classes about all the ways God is awesome, that you don't have to be awesome. Let God be God, because he's infinitely better at it than you. That's one of the joys of getting to teach Gen Z, is seeing that freedom, the freedom to take ourselves lightly because we take God so seriously. The way G.K. Chesterton famously put it, angels can fly because they take themselves so lightly. There's something to following God's heart that frees us up to be able to laugh at ourselves, to be able to sort of be the idiots we are, and take God seriously and follow his heart. There's something really freeing, I find, with the younger generations when that sort of clicks for them.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on, because the weight to create our own identity is crushing this generation, because they can't sustain it. And it's a moving target, right? The emotions keep moving, that they keep aiming desires and everything at. And I know you get into these. You have your book structured, and it's so helpful and so engaging. And I'll have links below for you to click on to buy this book, Don't Follow Your Heart, by Dr. Thaddeus Williams. But one of them, you got live your best life. I'm just going to read some of these. Live your best life. Hashtag okay boomer. Hashtag follow your heart. Hashtag be true to yourself. Hashtag you do you. Hashtag YOLO. Hashtag the answers are within. Hashtag authentic. Hashtag live the dream. Hashtag love is love. And you end with a Heretics manifesto, which we'll talk about in a minute in terms of a call to action. But maybe pick a few of these that you think are really important that not only students engage, but also the adults who care about them are able to spot the lie and help them
Yeah.
connect some dots. Could you maybe pick a couple of those? Let's pick one. Let's start with one. Which one do you want to start with?
Sure. Let's start with it's chapter 2 in the book. I frame this as these are the 10 commandments of self worship. We need to recognize we're up against more than just a trend in culture. What we're up against is a world religion, it's a cult. It has all the bearings of a traditional religion. It's got devotees with 91% of Americans saying look within for answers. It's got its patron saints and prophets from Fred Nietzsche, with his concept of the Superman who defines his own reality. It's got Saint Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who says your existence precedes your essence. You just exist. It's up to you to define your own essence, your own nature, your own reality. It's got Saint Aleister Crowley, who summed up his Satanism with the credo, "To thine own self be true." So it's got patron saints. It's got a fully orbed sort of systematic theology where I am the functional deity, and therefore my identity is unassailable. My feelings are perfect. Anybody who dares question them is a heretic or a blasphemer. And it's also got its own Decalogue. It's got its own 10 commandments. And so one of those commandments, I sum up with the hashtag OK Boomer. And the big idea there is thou shalt never be outdated, but always on the edge of the new. And so something about following your heart, the way it manifests in our culture is as cutting edge. This is innovative. This is forward looking. And so I'm thinking of, the Grammys a year ago where Sam Smith, who used to be a he and then became a she and then went back to he and then a non-binary, and sort of depends on the day of the week how Sam Smith is identifying, and understand behind that self-ID worldview is this concept that I and my emotions, my subjective states are the final word on reality. I get to define reality for myself. So Sam Smith is viewed as one of these pioneers, one of these trailblazers into this new, non-binary future. And so he, at the Grammys last year, with a transgender artist named Kim Petras, they did a song called Unholy. They performed their song Unholy, where Sam Smith is dressed up as Satan and all these, dancers are choreographed bowing down and worshiping the devil. And you had sort of your predictable Christian backlash. And the idea was, oh man, look how we're just pushing the envelope here. Look how we are, transgressing the cultural mores. And it's like, really? Are you guys that edgy? Little Nas X had his 666 Nikes with a drop of human blood in them, a couple of years ago. AC/DC was singing Highway to Hell 40 years ago. Robert Johnson had his Deal with the Devil on the crossroads of Georgia, over 100 years ago. I argue in the book that this whole okay boomer attitude, for those who haven't heard that phrase, the idea is okay boomer, meaning you're a baby boomer, you're out of touch, you're old, you don't understand all this new non-binary, edgy, cool, innovative, forward-looking stuff that we're about. You're just too old-fashioned. And so in that chapter, I argue that this idea of creating your own identity, all the marketing is just paper thin. Once you poke through it, you see that it's hardly new. In fact, it is quite literally the oldest lie in the book. Define yourself, follow your heart, be your true self, live your truth is quite literally the oldest lie in the book. Look at Genesis 3. Genesis 3, it's the famous scene of, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Here's the serpent figure. Here's Eve. And in verse 5 of Genesis 3, the serpent says, hey, if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the language is you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Yeah. Like God, knowing good and evil. And that language baffled me for years and years. And I was reading through the great Dutch neo-Calvinist Abraham Kuyper, his book Common Grace, and reading him, the light bulb turned on. He says that the Hebrew here for knowing, it doesn't mean I know it like book knowledge. It doesn't mean I know it by experience. It's a certain Hebrew turn of phrase that the closest English equivalent would be something like a maker's knowledge, meaning I know it because I made it that way. I know it because I sovereignly chose it to be what it is. It would be like, I give the example in the book of one of my old roommates after college plays bass for a band called Linkin Park. His name is Dave, and I would ask Dave questions about their songs when they were working on their sophomore release, the Meteora album. And I would grill him, what effect are you using on the bass? Whose idea was that key change and so forth? And I never once stumped him because he knew the songs. He didn't know them because he studied the sheet music. He didn't know them because he experienced them and listened to them over and over. He knew them because he made them. And so that's the kind of knowledge God as sovereign, has over his creation. He knows it because he made it that way. Yeah. And so that's what Satan is offering our first parents, is you can have that kind of sovereignty. You can be the ultimate decider. You can be the sovereign meaning maker. And then it's followed by the phrase good and evil, which in ancient Judaism, they would use opposites to describe everything in between. So if we hopped in a time machine and went back to the BCs and hung out with ancient Jews, they would say black and white to refer to every color. They would say the Beatles and Nickelback to refer to every band, right? They in this context, they say good and evil to refer to everything. So the original satanic offer was to be hashtag authentic, to hashtag follow your heart, to hashtag live your dream, where you can create and define the meaning of your biology. You can create and define the meaning of gender. You can create and define the meaning of marriage. You can create and define the meaning of life. And so I just wanted to debunk this, the propaganda that this is new and cutting edge, and saying it doesn't get any more old-fashioned, any more uber traditionalist than telling people to follow their heart.
Yeah, and so that's one of the hashtags you deal with in terms of the self-worship lies that you interact with. So that's the hashtag OK Boomer, kind of that piece. What would be another one that you would think would be really important for people to understand? I know there's 10 in here, so we're not going to have time to do all 10. That's why people need to buy the book. But also, which one would be another one that you think, man, this is vital that we get our heads and our hearts around?
Sure. I think one that pops to mind is commandment number 4, hashtag be true to yourself. That's thou shalt be courageous enough to defy other people's expectations. In other words, chart your own course, march to the beat of your own drum. Don't be inauthentic by following other people's expectations for you. And I go to show that whole concept is just, in the final analysis, it's nonsense. So let's take a little thought experiment here. Let's say you have a kid named Johnny, and let's say Johnny is being raised in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And let's say Johnny is familiar with some of the political strife that's happened there. And he finds in himself a desire to be a soldier, to be courageous, to fight to be a freedom fighter, to combat oppression through force if necessary. He finds those desires within him. Now let's take that same Johnny and let's pick him up by the scruff of the neck and drop him in the gender studies department at, say, UC Berkeley. And here he has professors who are, teaching him that, gender is nothing but a social construct. And, Johnny, I think you would really thrive as a interpretive dancer. And you could just really wow people on stage. Wow. And so he might look within and be like, that could be kind of fun. And so I should follow my heart. In both scenarios, whether he's in Belfast or in Berkeley, he'd be able to introspect and probably find some desires pulling him in this or that direction. And let's say he's now following his heart. In either scenario, he's under the delusion he's following his heart. What he's really doing is he's following the specific subset of desires that are endorsed by the influencers in his life. So he's hardly the Superman, the Ubermensch that he thinks he is, charting his own path across the skies. He's really just an obedient cow, to borrow Nietzsche's categories, just sort of mooing along with whatever herd is around him. And so when it comes to somebody who introspects and finds competing sexual desires, maybe there's the desire to start a family, to have a stable monogamous relationship. I can really see some value there. But then there's this competing desire to sort of play the field and accrue as many notches on the bedpost as possible. Depending on the context that person finds himself in, they're going to go one way or the other, thinking they're charting their course, where it's pretty obvious in today's cultural moment what the propaganda is if you take that faithful monogamous path, man, you're being outdated and you're being a cow. You need to go out there and play the field. And so now people are taking their cues from certain sexual ideologues, certain architects of the sexual revolution, whose names they probably don't even know, but who they are living their lives in religious devotion to. So people who are living this kind of sexual revolutionary ideology have probably never heard of Alfred Kinsey, the author of the Kinsey Report. They probably never heard of Wilhelm Reich, who invented the whole gender theory concept. They probably never heard of John Money, who advanced the whole concept of being gender non-binary. They've probably never heard of Judith Butler, who said that gender is just a mere performance. They've probably never heard of the ideologues, but they are faithful devotees to those ideologues. So this concept of being true to yourself, when you deconstruct it, it really turns out to be true to a bunch of ideologues you've never heard of, who I argue in that chapter actually led extremely miserable lives. Mm-hmm. This didn't pan out well for the ideologues themselves. And the people who are living out their doctrines are similarly being buried under the weight of their own bad philosophies.
Yeah, and I think you document that really well, because again, I think people think they're being novel, they think they're being creative, when in reality they're really dancing to the beat of these people who've laid out these ideas for them, and they're just leading them really in many ways over a cliff, going, hey, this is not going anywhere good, but you think you're being novel and innovative and just, wow, authentic in the whole thing.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I think I give the example in the book, it's like the punk rocker paradox, that if you go to a punk rock show, punk was originally, let's be nonconformists, let's violate all the taboos of sort of mainstream straight-laced culture. You go to a punk show, everybody is wearing the same, almost like a uniform, the same black skinny jeans with similar tattoos and similar spiky hair and similar piercings, so that it looks like, man, all these nonconformists are pretty darn good at conforming. To be a true punk rocker in a context like that would be to show up in slacks with a button down shirt and your hair combed. Who's the punk rocker at the punk rock show it's kind of the stereotypical dork. And there's something to that in the culture, that the real cows, again, borrowing Nietzsche's categories of the herd, the whole herd in our day is following this follow your heart dogma. Yeah. To be the true Superman, to go against the flow, to really be countercultural these days, is to keep the actual 10 Commandments, to worship the actual God, to tell the truth, to be faithful to your spouse, to not take stuff that isn't yours. That's revolution. That's what it is to be a heretic these days, to be a heretic against the cult of self-worship.
Yeah, to be countercultural for the right biblical, true, and good reasons. To actually pursue those things as opposed to this kind of idol of self worship, which you've documented so well. So that's kind of the hashtag OK Boomer. That's hashtag kind of this be true to yourself kind of idea. What about let's see, which one of these do you want to hit next? There's so many different ones that illustrate our culture. Where do you want to go? It's like survey says, like which one do you want to hit?
Yeah, there's a lot that jump off the page, but one I would say that whole hashtag live your best life thing. It's the first commandment of self worship. Always act in accord with your chief end to glorify and enjoy yourself forever. So I was at a Martin Luther King Jr. Day event. I was speaking for a couple hundred EV free pastors up in the Twin Cities a couple weeks ago, and at a certain point, it was -7 degrees out there with the wind
Okay.
chill, but it at like -30 or something. It was pretty intense. I actually got to use the God's frozen chosen joke in a
And it was
context where it
and it was ready.
doesn't work in Southern California, man. It does not work here in 80-degree temperatures.
Yeah.
But in this room full of pastors, I said, okay, turn to your neighbor and say, you're awesome. And they had fun with that. They turned to each other. You're awesome. You're awesome. You're awesome. And they said, look, you just spoke a biblical theological truth. You are surrounded by image bearers of God. As C.S. Lewis famously put it, you've never met a mere mortal. So, yeah, you're surrounded by awesomeness. But now turn to your neighbor and say, you are nowhere near as awesome as God. You are nowhere near as awesome as God. And they had a lot of
Hmm.
fun with that, taking each other down a peg. And so there is something in the field of positive psychology. There's been a lot of work done in the last 20 years documenting the effects of awe. And what the positive psychologists are finding is that we're really hardwired to be awestruck. There's out here by me in Southern California, there's a guy called Paul Piff up at UCI who has subjected people to what he calls elicitors of awe. It might be a panorama of the Grand Canyon. It might be footage of the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. It might be photos from the James Webb or Hubble telescope of some glowing space nebula. And he found that once he could instantiate a mental state of awe, people became less selfish. They became more what Piff calls pro-social. And they ended up taking better care of creation. They took better care of God's world. Out in Arizona at ASU, there's a positive psychologist named Michelle Chioda, and she did a fascinating study. She found that she would give people terrible articles to read that were just riddled with fallacies and just bad arguments. And then she would subject them to elicitors of awe. And what she discovered was that in a mental state of awe, people were less dupable. They were less taken in by terrible arguments. They could spot fallacies more
Hmm.
quickly, and their reasoning powers, their cognition functioned better in a state of awe. And so what we have here is yet another case of the science slowly catching up with Scripture. Scripture has been telling us for thousands of years, one of the most common biblical commands is the command to be awestruck. In Hebrew, it's the word yirah, to fear the Lord, to revere God, to be awestruck at his sheer magnitude. And so I argue in the first chapter that self-worship, some scholars these days, friends like Carl Trueman would say, expressive individualism. That's really what my book is about, this trend of expressive
Mm-hmm.
individualism. I argue that it robs people of awe. And it robs people of awe because at the end of the day, Jonathan, we're not as awesome as we like to think we are.
Yeah.
We just aren't. Compared to the holy, holy, holy God of the Bible, compared to the God who is the King of ages, immortal, to him be praised forever and ever, to him who is holy, 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 we hold all the awesomeness of a mossy fishbowl compared to him. And so I lay out at the end of that chapter I'll just hit a few quickly.
Yeah.
Some of the ways that God is infinitely more awesome, infinitely more interesting than we are. So the basics of the creator-creature distinction, right? The starting point of a good Christian worldview, the creator-creature distinction. How is God God in ways that we aren't? So God never lies or breaks promises. We do. God isn't bound by time. We are. God is self-existent. He requires no one to bring him into being or keep him alive. We need a mother and a father to bring us into existence. We need oxygen, food, water, and for some of us, caffeine to continue existing. God is sovereign, enthroned over the entire universe. He's the Lord of galaxies, nations, and subatomic particles. We might pretend to be sovereign, but our control over the world is a pipe dream. God isn't bound by space. He's present everywhere. We are circumscribable. We're where we are right now. God is infinitely satisfying. God is the supreme artist. God can create ex nihilo by an act of sheer artistic willpower. We can only create from pre-existing stuff. God is gracious and merciful. He knows all things. His wisdom is boundless. He's one being who exists eternally as three equal interloving persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. God feels perfectly. He's never temperamental, moody, or overcome by wild emotions. Our emotions often vacillate and fall out of sync with reality. God is holy. He transcends all sin, all evil, all injustice. We slip into sin more times a day than we can count. God is infinitely and altogether awesome. We are not.
Hmm.
And so self-worship in the final analysis, it promises our most awesome life. At the end of the day, it robs us of awe by having us follow our hearts instead of God's.
Yeah, no, I think that's so well said. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book, Don't Follow Your Heart, is you got to invite some other people to contribute and share some of their stories and things like that in there, which I think are really helpful and insightful, just learning from their own discovery of this kind of thing. I know people, like, for example, you have Joni Eareckson Tada in there, for example. Maybe share something that she reflected on, or maybe an insight from her, maybe share a little bit about her story for people who may not know. I mean, she's amazing, but what was something that we could learn from what she shared?
Yeah, so my favorite part of the book is the end of every chapter where you get to hear from somebody not me. And so we have Josh McDowell shares his powerful story of enduring years of sexual abuse as a child, and how that just threw him into an identity crisis and messed him up until um, he found his true identity in how the creator of the universe defines him. There's stories from J.P. Moreland in his ongoing battles with anxiety and panic over the years. He's diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and how he's been able to navigate that, not by defining himself, but by letting God define him. There's a friend of mine, Jamal Bandy, shares his story. So the end of every chapter ends that way. Joni Eareckson Tada, for the listeners who may not be familiar with her story, she was involved in a diving accident as a teenager that severed her spine. It rendered her paraplegic and wheelchair bound ever since. And she says in her story that right after her accident, she felt like all of her dreams were dashed. She felt useless. She went to some very dark, nihilistic places. She says that she took solace in drinking bottles of scotch and feeling sorry for herself. And if all she had was herself to sustain her through those dark seasons, she says she would have just, buckled under that impossible weight. Um, but God stepped in his grace, redefined her and gave her meaning and purpose. And she has just been blessing hundreds of thousands of people ever since. She's a painter. There's inspirational videos you can see of her with the paintbrush in her mouth, just making beautiful, beautiful art to the glory of God. She has become a mover and shaker in terms of the rights of the disabled. and treating everybody as the image bearers of God that they are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask her, she said, and just to quote directly from her, she says, "I find great comfort and joy in dying to self and living every day to serve the Lord Jesus and others around me whose disabilities are far more profound than mine. What else could be more important than practicing Christianity with sleeves rolled up among the needy? When I do become tired, I'm inspired by the life of Jesus, who, even as he was nailed on the cross and in great pain, nevertheless kept serving others, like the thief, his mother, and the soldiers who needed forgiveness. Ephesians 5:1 tells me to imitate him. So I'm heaven bent on honoring my Jesus, serving others, finishing the race, completing the task of testifying to the gospel of grace. So here I sit, glad that I have not been healed on the outside, but glad that I have been healed on the inside, healed from my own self-centered wants and wishes. So
Wow.
these stories drive home the point that instead of following our hearts, which David Foster Wallace famously described as being kings and queens of our own skull-sized castles. That's
Hmm.
such a good way to put it. When we become our own functional deities, we're trapped in our own little skull-sized kingdoms. Johnny Erickson taught us saying, Jesus breaks you out of your own skull. He opens a wider world to you where it's not about your three best friends, me, myself, and I. It's how do I serve Jesus? How do I serve my neighbor? How do I uh, love hurting people around me? That's what makes life worth living, not what 84% of Americans think, just following your own desires.
No, that's so good, and it's such a great addition to the book that's already so clear and insightful to have these stories of going, look, this is how I've applied these things. I've gone the different direction than what culture says is normal and good and innovative and all the right ideas. And so helpful. In your book, in your chapter on You Do You, I know you say something to the effect of, our generation needs a million more Sophie Scholl's and Frederick Douglass's and Wilberforce's. Maybe people aren't familiar. I mean, all of them have tremendous stories, but maybe say a word about Sophie Scholl's and her White Rose Society and just kind of like how that's a way of vision of something that maybe people who don't know her story of courage and what that looks like to maybe inspire some people who might be
Sure.
watching this to think forward.
Yeah, you look at the courageous Christians of history who really changed the world. None of them were about following their hearts. They weren't. They were all, without exception, about following God's heart. There was a standard higher than their own subjective emotional states that they tried to attune their lives to. And so Sophie Scholl was a teenager studying at a university in Munich, Germany, in the 1930s, and her big brother Hans loved Jesus, and they saw Hitler rising to power. They saw the Third Reich galvanizing its power. They saw Nazism begin to take root and spread around Munich and around Deutschland. And so they said, we got to do something about this. Fuhrer is running around like he's Lord. No, Jesus is Lord, not Hitler. And so they started they started publishing these underground leaflets. You can read them all online. There's links in the book that'll take you there. But basically arguing this guy's a phony. What he's perpetrating is evil, this view of Aryan supremacy, this violent anti Semitism is contrary to a Christian worldview. And so they started mobilizing a resistance movement in Munich, and their white rose leaflets gradually made their way around Germany and helped inspire a lot of Germans to stand up against the Nazis. And ultimately, Hans and Sophie lost their lives in their resistance against Nazism. And so I'm arguing self worship strips us of that kind of courage because there is no real moral adventure to aspire to. There is no heroism to attain that's above and beyond me. Because if I'm the standard, if I'm my own standard, by definition, there's nothing above me to reach towards. There's no virtue outside of me. And so that makes life self-worship makes life impossibly dull. It sort of presses down from the sky and pushes down any kind of mountainous terrain that I could venture towards to do something noble. It flattens all of that because I am my own high point at every given moment. And man, how dull that becomes. And so at the end of every chapter, I give what's called the Heretics Field Manual. And there I just give really down to earth suggestions. Here's 5 things you can do this week to be
Mm-hmm.
countercultural. Here's 5 ways you can act out your heresy this week against the cult of self worship. So I tried my
Good.
best to give a field manual, make it as down to earth, so that we can hopefully change the tide of a self obsessed culture.
Absolutely, and it's so helpful because you bring together both the ideas and the personal and the applicational so well. Let's do this. I want you to kind of share if you were going to pick 3 things. I know it's going to be challenging to pick to help if a student is watching this Gen Z and they're going, hey, what does it look like for me to be countercultural? What would you encourage me to do? And then I want to come back and if a parent's watching this, what would be the 3 things that you would encourage them to emphasize as they raise their kids in an environment of a biblical worldview? But let's start with students first. What would be 3 things that you would say, hey, these are important for you right now, student, teenager, young adult, for you to put into practice?
Yeah, that's great. I would say number one, a study was just dropped that found Bible reading, which if you unpack what is it to read the Bible, it's to say, here's an authority that I want to take more seriously than my own fallen feelings, right? So if I feel like a nobody today, if I feel like a loser, if I feel unlovable, if I feel like damaged goods, if I feel like a mess, I'm going to take what God says is true about me as infinitely more trustworthy than what my fallen emotions say about me today. So spend time in the Word. This recent study found that folks who read their Bible once or twice a week experience basically no difference from people who don't read their Bible at all.
Hmm.
So 1 to 2 times a week isn't really cutting the mustard. 3 times a week in this study found you do start to see some positive uptick in different areas. But 4 times a week seemed to be the magic number. People who read the Word 4 times a week experienced significantly higher levels of overall life satisfaction. Their relationships got significantly healthier. Um, Pornography addiction plummeted. Alcoholism plummeted. Um, Relational health, physical health. There was a list in this study of at least a dozen benefits that all skyrocket once we are imbibing the Word of God at least 4 times a week. So I would say start there because that is a countercultural liturgy. To
Mm-hmm.
immerse yourself in the Word of God is to say, I'm going to take God's Word more seriously than my fallen emotions. Secondly, I would say um, start playing spot the lie with yourself and maybe even with your friends. You know, you go out and catch a movie, you're Netflixing with some friends, but get used to training your own mind to spot this propaganda when it's coming at you.
Mm-hmm.
I would say those would be 2 big things. And number 3, you got to be where most of these heretical liturgies happen, the way God ordained them, should be in the local church. In the local church, you're having a communal experience that is supposed to break you out of your own head. It's supposed to break you out of your own skull sized kingdom. There's something to corporate worship where you are singing, you're putting melody to truth about God simultaneously and in harmony with a room of other people putting truth to God to melody all in the same space. There's power to that to pull you out of your own head, to pull you out of your own heart. And then you're submitting yourself to the preaching and teaching of God's word, which is another way of pushing back on treating your emotions as if they're scripture, is to actually hear scripture. The fourth thing for students, I would say, buy my book and then buy a dozen more. Um, just kidding, but it would help.
Yeah.
Um, So to parents, I would say think on what are some liturgies you can integrate into home life that will be training your kids to be countercultural, that'll train your kids to be heretics against self worship. So, something just real simple I do right behind me here at our dinner table. We do every Monday, we do what's called Magnificent Monday. We go around the table, what's something magnificent about God? Just to sort of reorient them that, hey, that's right, I'm not the center of reality. On Tuesdays, we'll do Terrible Tuesdays. What's something terrible in the world that we can pray about? We do Wicked Wednesdays, are very important. Wicked Wednesdays, as a family, we go around and acknowledge something that we've done that's sinful, and we take it to the cross together as a family.
Wow.
Now, by doing that, that is extremely countercultural because we're teaching the kids and modeling for the kids that we aren't perfect, that your emotions aren't always reliable, that we make mistakes, and so we need to take those to the cross. We do Thankful Thursdays to remind us that everything good, true, beautiful, and awesome is a gift from God. And then we do Freaked Out Fridays to say, look, our emotions sometimes, if we follow our hearts, a lot of time our hearts are really anxious and freaked out. And there's a God who's sovereign, who's bigger than our hearts, and we can bring that stuff to him.
Hmm.
So we tend to do that on a week in, week out basis, and it creates categories in the kid's soul that are the proper categories of following God's heart instead of their own. So find liturgies like that. There's more suggestions in the book for
Yep.
things you can do at home, but make it, and also just I would add Spot the Lie. Play Spot the Lie with the kids. They
Mm-hmm.
love it. Helps them be discerning. Do not underestimate how aggressively the cult of self worship is being marketed to them. Do
Mm-hmm.
not underestimate that. There are script writers out there, there are influencers out there who are trying aggressively to dupe your kids into falling for the old serpent's lie that they can create their own reality. So don't underestimate that. Counteract it with the gospel.
Love that. Love that. So those are helpful things for students, helpful things for parents. I know you've created a website, jointheheretics.com. Tell me why you created that, and I want to encourage people to find out more about this book there, but tell me why you created that and what they can find if they go there.
Yeah, so jointheheretics.com. You can hop on there to find the Heretics Manifesto, which is where the whole book ends. And I'll just give folks a taste of it. It's something they can sign, they can add their name to. I think there's somewhere we had about 500 original signatories. And I think since then I think we're in the ballpark of 1,000. But you can add your name there. You can read through the whole manifesto there. But it's an attempt to give some momentum to this kind of cultural heresy against the cult of self-worship, and just to expose it for what it is. So in the manifesto, I say, the cult of worship promises our most awesome life. It robs us of awe. It markets itself as cutting edge, but it's hopelessly outdated. It commands us to follow our hearts, but our hearts are divided and depraved. It encourages us to be true to ourselves, but it makes us unwitting devotees to miserable men. It tells us to be our own moral masters, but it strips us of courage and credibility. It calls us to the rush of unfettered experience and adventure, but it becomes impossibly dull. It tells us the answers are within, but that's where the problems are. It beckons us to be authentic, but it makes us arrogant. It claims that we can break the structure of reality, but reality breaks us back. It advertises itself as loving, but makes bigots and haters of us all. And then the second half of the manifesto, if folks want to check that out, is here's the positive project. Here's what it is to
Mm-hmm.
actually follow God's heart. Here's 10 things that we can do to be countercultural today. So folks can find that at jointheheretics.com. There's all kinds of supplementary materials to the book that they can find there. There's interviews. There's even some scholarly articles I've written that go deeper than the book on certain topics. There's testimonials. There's even an EP of original songs that I wrote and recorded that go along with
Wow.
the book that folks can download and rock out to. So yeah, all kinds of stuff there. That's kind of the hub. There's even a fun little promo video when they first hop on to jointheheretics.com where you get to see me roaming around a city with a sledgehammer and destroying stuff. So it's a lot of fun.
I'm sure that was fun, really fun to film that.
It was.
Oh, you can't roam around the house and start hitting stuff with a sledgehammer, but you can roam around the city, and that's okay.
Well, we needed close-ups of the sledgehammer actually hitting bricks. And so we ended up using my barbecue in the backyard as these bricks. And so we had to get a few shots of me breaking bricks, and that was hard to do because, like, no, this is the barbecue. But, we were willing to sacrifice for the art.
I love it. I love it. So joinheretics.com. So Thaddeus, give one last quick tweet version of encouragement to people watching this to take one step from today.
Yeah, one final encouragement. So sort of circling back to a point I made earlier, take a brief pulse on how you feel about yourself right now. Maybe you feel great. Maybe you feel like you're just crushing it. Life is going your way. Maybe you feel not so great. Maybe you're down on yourself. Maybe you feel just really, really tired and worn out. Maybe you feel guilty. Maybe you're shame-ridden. Take a quick temperature of your emotional state. And then hear me when I say what God says is true about you is infinitely more trustworthy than how your feelings, what your feelings are telling you is true about you right now. So let me just close on that thought. Again, returning to the wisdom of my 13-year-old a couple years ago. Follow God's heart, not your own heart. Well, what is God's heart towards you? In John 17, it's the prayer of Jesus to the Father the night before his execution. He says he's praying for all believers through time. He says, I'm praying not just for the apostles, but for everybody who will believe in me through their word. That's us, that's you. And in that prayer in John 17, Jesus makes this staggering claim. He says, Father, you loved them, that's us, even as you loved me. Even as is a little Greek contraction, the word kathos. It means to the same degree or equivalent to. So what Jesus is saying here is you are loved, I am loved, to the same degree that the Father loves the Son within the Trinity. How does the Father love the Son within the Trinity? He loves the Son infinitely. He loves the Son irreversibly. He loves the Son unapologetically. He loves the Son with the full weight of his divine perfection. And so as you seek to follow God's heart today, take him at his word. How are you loved today? Regardless of what your emotions are saying, you are loved irreversibly, unapologetically, with the full weight of divine perfections. So there's a closing thought and encouragement for your listeners, Jonathan.
Love it. And so the book is Don't Follow Your Heart by Dr. Thaddeus Williams. The website is jointheheretics.com. You can learn more about that. But Thaddeus, thank you so much for stopping by today. This has been so helpful and really appreciate all that went into writing this book and spending the time with us today.